I want to talk now about a major shift in priorities when it comes to the way each state spends its money. There's a trend happening all across the country that shows that schools and the education system in general are getting fewer and fewer resources. So what does this mean? Well, it translates into larger class sizes for younger students, teachers losing their jobs, teachers who get to keep their jobs being forced to take pay cuts, and those who want to continue their education in college having minimized opportunities to do so. Meanwhile, the prison population is growing, and the prison system is getting more and more from state budgets. Now, today I want to focus specifically on the state of California and on a study just released by the nonpartisan research group California Common Sense, which broke this down in the Golden State, and the numbers are dramatic. Since 1980, higher education spending has decreased by 13%. That's adjusted for inflation. Where spending for California prisons has increased by 436%. So, what's going on here? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Mark Maurer, Executive Director of the Sentencing Project and also the author of Race to Incarcerate. So, Mark, I know that your research has focused mostly on the prison aspect of all this, but just to start off, let's speak a little more broadly. What do you think is behind this shift?
Well, it's basically the results of the so-called Get Tough movement of the last 30 years. The idea that the way to promote public safety is to get tough on criminals, as it's phrased, send more people to prison, keep them there for longer periods of time. So policies like mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, the war on drugs. And on one hand, they've been very successful. They've, resulted in an enormous rise in the prison population, but as you point out, enormous trade-offs in terms of public services and support that we see.
Yeah, this Get Tough movement you certainly see in political campaigns, especially at the state and local level. People who are running, they want to show that they're tough. They're going to lock people up more readily, but we don't often talk about the alternate consequences of this, that you have, overpopulated prisons with people who aren't really, violent offenders. Let me put some numbers up there, some specific numbers, and take a look at spending by the state of California. This is according to that study released by California Common Sense. We have a graph, and this shows each system's portion of the state of California's general funds. Now, the blue line there, that is that downward slope. That's higher education, and the green line, that is expenditures for corrections. You see just sort of those dramatic pictures there using this line graph. And then we also have a population growth of each. You can see there's a huge rise of corrections inmates and barely a little blip in the increase of students getting a higher education. So what's the deal, Mark? I mean, do we really have that many more criminals since the 1980s?
Well, the problem is, if all these people were, violent, dangerous people who were threatening all of us completely, some people might say, well, we have no choice but to lock them all up. An enormous part of the growth of the prison system has been through the war on drugs. Most of those people are in the lower levels of the drug trade. For many people in prison, all sorts of problems of substance abuse, mental illness, abuse. It doesn't excuse the crimes they may have committed, but it does suggest that there are other interventions we can take advantage of that could reduce the prison population and get at some of these underlying issues. So we're spending massive resources at the back end of the system after the harm has been done, and it robs policymakers with having options for making other kinds of investments.
Now, you've mentioned twice, Mark, the war on drugs, so I want to talk a little bit more about it. This is something that certainly I grew up with, hearing time and time again. And it seems like a war that everyone was behind. Let's fight against those illegal drug sellers who poison our children. Talk a little bit about the story that isn't often told regarding the war on drugs.
Well, substance abuse is a problem. We've long had problems with illegal drugs, with alcohol, all kinds of substances. And the question is, how do we approach this? And what's happened over the last several decades is that conscious decisions have been made that we will fight this as a criminal justice problem, to the exclusion, or at least a reduction, of fighting it as a prevention problem, a health problem, and the like. So if we look at resources, the war on drugs, 2/3 of the resources go to law enforcement incarceration, just 1/3 to prevention and treatment. Now, if you think of things like campaigns to reduce smoking and other kinds of addictions, we have some good success stories there. When you put resources into dealing with that in a public health approach, we've seen the results. Fewer children, fewer adults are smoking these days than a generation ago. When it comes to the war on drugs, we had very heavy mandatory sentences, people doing spending 5, 10, 20 years in prison, in many cases for not being a drug kingpin, being a lower level person. So spending millions and millions of dollars to incarcerate now 500,000 people behind bars for a drug offense. And again, these are finite resources. We have options. We've chosen, whether consciously or not, to invest them in the prison system.
So what's the answer here? I mean, how do we change this course? Or do you think the people in charge even want to?
Well, I think many people do. There's now development of what are called drug courts around the country, and the idea there is that we should try treatment as a first alternative rather than incarceration for many people for whom substance abuse is the underlying contributor to crime. We can get better results if we get to commit a crime in order to get drug treatment. So we need to see much greater expansion, particularly for low-income people. You know, if you're wealthy, you can go to the Betty Ford Clinic and get world-class treatment for your drug addiction. If you're poor, you're going to be on a waiting list for publicly funded support.
Yeah, the prison's not just serving as a drug rehab, alcohol rehab center. We should also mention oftentimes serving as a place where, you know, the mentally ill end up, because so many services have been cut for treatment for them, and that's a trend that's really changed as well. But just once again, you know, that's a tough thing for a lot of people to understand, especially people don't have it in their lives. But education, I mean, everyone knows children or the value of going to college, even if it's, you know, a community college or, you know, just a smaller, you know, less known degree, you know. But why aren't more people speaking out? When you see the graphs like we put up on screen here, I mean, this is a nonpartisan group that found these numbers. Why aren't more people kind of speaking out to change this? Well,
I think the value of research such as this is that it does put these two trends together. You know, far too often parents see that their kids' college tuition bill's gone up 5 or 10%. They're outraged. It puts a strain on the family finances. It seems to me when we do that at a public institution, we should probably include a little note and say, oh, and by the way, do you know how much of this increase in tuition is going to support an expanded prison system? You know, we're making those trade-offs, but nobody comes out and says it very directly. And I think we need to think about where do we want.
In bright, bold letters, right?
That's one way to do it, right? And call attention to the policy considerations. You know, how much public safety do we get from the prison system? How much opportunity we create in higher education? And what do some of these trade-offs look like?
All right, Mark Maurer, Executive Director with the Sentencing Project. Thanks for your insight. I know you've done a whole lot of research on this. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, too.